Hello everyone, I'm Alex, and today I bring you a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat, a tale of betrayal, survival, and an unstoppable rise from the ashes. Imagine building a perfect life, only to have it ripped away by the people you trust the most. That's exactly what happens to Claire. Her own sister sets a trap. Her mother turns against her. Her husband stands frozen as her world crumbles. But Claire is not the kind of woman who stays broken. With nothing left to lose, she makes a choice, to fight back, to expose the truth, and to take back everything that was stolen from her. This story grips your heart, proving that true strength comes from reclaiming your dignity, choosing self-worth, and rising above betrayal. The morning sunlight bathed the sleek surfaces of Claire Bennett's modern kitchen in a golden glow. Through the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of their luxury condominium, the Charles River sparkled, reflecting the life she and her husband, Daniel, had built together. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as she set a plate of warm brioche and organic fruit on the marble countertop, everything arranged with quiet precision. "Busy day ahead?" she asked as she poured the dark liquid into his favorite ceramic mug. Daniel, dressed in a tailored navy suit, adjusted his cufflinks and offered her a small, knowing smile. "Yeah. A big presentation for the downtown redevelopment project. But I should be home by 7. His voice was calm, self-assured, the voice of a man who had earned his place in Boston's elite real estate circles. Claire admired that about him. His confidence, his ambition, his unwavering ability to navigate the high-stakes corporate world. After 3 years of marriage, their life together was polished, structured, free of chaos. She had no complaints. Daniel was everything a husband should be, supportive, reliable, always respectful of her demanding career as a marketing director at a luxury boutique hotel in Kendall Square. On weekends, they took long walks through Cambridge, stopping by Whole Foods to pick out the best produce before cooking elaborate meals together. They hosted intimate dinner parties with friends, occasionally inviting his mother, Evelyn, a woman of grace and quiet influence in Boston's social scene. And yet, beneath the veneer of perfection, there was something Claire could not shake, a tightness in her chest that surfaced when she thought about her own family. While her life with Daniel was refined and controlled, the world she had left behind was anything but. Her mother, Susan, and younger sister, Vanessa, still lived in the aging house in Somerville where she had grown up. The once pristine home had begun to crumble, much like their relationships. Vanessa, fresh off a messy divorce, had spiraled into an extravagant lifestyle beyond her means, designer handbags, sky-high credit card bills, and a growing appetite for gambling. She paraded around Boston's high-end boutiques, wearing luxury brands she could not afford, masking the mounting debt that threatened to swallow her whole. Their mother, Susan, was no better. She had spent years enabling Vanessa's recklessness, writing endless checks, draining her retirement savings in the process. Whenever Claire voiced her concern, Susan dismissed her, as if Claire's success, her carefully curated life, had made her incapable of understanding family loyalty. "You have everything now, Claire," Susan would say with a touch of bitterness. "The least you could do is help your sister." But it was never about helping. It was about sacrificing. And lately, Vanessa had taken an unsettling interest in Daniel. At first, it was subtle. A few unexpected visits, a little too much familiarity in her tone. She laughed at his jokes with a practiced ease, touched his arm just a little too long. But then came the pointed questions. Real estate must be lucrative these days, Vanessa had mused one evening, swirling the wine in her glass as she leaned in toward Daniel. Claire had seen the way her sister looked at him, not with admiration, but with calculation. It was a game Vanessa had played before. Manipulation was second nature to her. Claire knew better than to ignore the signs. But what she did not yet realize was that this was no ordinary game. Vanessa was not just toying with boundaries. She was laying the foundation for something much darker. And Claire was about to learn, in the most brutal way possible, that the deepest betrayals always come from those who share your blood. The first time Claire felt true unease, Vanessa had appeared at their condominium unannounced. It was a Wednesday evening, and Claire had just finished a grueling day at work, reviewing a major partnership deal for her hotel's executive team. As she unlocked the door, the sharp click of high heels echoed against the marble floor. Vanessa stood in the foyer, her coat draped over one arm, a designer handbag hanging from her wrist. The overpowering scent of Chanel filled the air as she flashed a slow, deliberate smile. Her lipstick, a deep crimson, was applied with precision, her silk dress clinging to her figure in a way that felt intentional. "Surprise," she announced, her voice light, almost teasing. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by." Claire stiffened, glancing toward the living room, where Daniel sat with his laptop open. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie loosened, his expression unreadable. Vanessa didn't wait for an invitation. She slipped off her coat and made her way toward the bar cart, pouring herself a glass of red wine with the ease of someone who had done it before. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," she said, swirling the wine in her glass before taking a slow sip. Claire forced a polite smile. "Everything okay?" Vanessa let out a small laugh, settling onto the couch like she belonged there. "Oh, you know me. Always keeping busy." Then, she turned her gaze to Daniel, her eyes lingering just a second too long. "And how about you, Daniel? Work treating you well?" Claire felt the moment tighten around her. It was subtle, the way Vanessa tilted her head, the way her voice softened just a fraction, the way her manicured fingers traced accent patterns along the rim of her glass. A calculated move. A test. Daniel, to his credit, remained composed. He nodded, offering a neutral response about a project deadline, but Claire didn't miss the way his jaw tightened slightly. Vanessa didn't just visit that night. The appearances became more frequent. Sometimes it was an unannounced stop after her yoga class, sometimes an invitation to dinner that Daniel, being polite, didn't refuse quickly enough. Claire tried to tell herself she was overreacting, that Vanessa was just looking for connection after her divorce. But then came the gifts. Claire found the first one in Daniel's study, a Montblanc pen, sleek and expensive, with the initials VB engraved delicately on the cap. When she confronted him, he looked as surprised as she was. "She gave it to me after a meeting," he explained, rubbing his temple. "I didn't think anything of it." Claire gripped the pen tighter. "Daniel, Vanessa doesn't give gifts without expecting something in return." His sigh was heavy. "I know. I didn't want to start a fight over nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Vanessa was testing limits, and Claire wasn't the only one turning a blind eye. When she brought up her concerns at brunch, Susan waved a dismissive hand. "Vanessa has been through a lot," she said, lifting her teacup to her lips. "She just needs support right now." Support. That was what Susan had always called it. It wasn't support, it was enabling. It was permission to wreak havoc without consequences. And then came the night Claire could no longer ignore it. She arrived home late, exhaustion clinging to her bones. The lights in the condo were dim, the faint glow of the city skyline casting long shadows across the floor. Expecting Daniel to be in the study or watching the news, she walked into the living room, only to find Vanessa. Seated comfortably on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, Vanessa turned, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Hey, sis," she greeted smoothly. Claire's pulse spiked. "What are you doing here?" Vanessa stretched her legs lazily, her eyes gleaming with something Claire couldn't quite place. "Relax," she drawled. "Daniel invited me over for a drink. We were just talking." Claire's gaze snapped toward the kitchen, where Daniel stood, his expression guarded. His tie was loosened, his posture stiff. Vanessa smirked, swirling her wine. "You really should appreciate what you have, Claire," she murmured. "A man like Daniel. Someone else might just take him if you're not careful." The words slithered through the air like a warning. Claire gripped her bag tighter. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't Vanessa being reckless. This was intentional. Vanessa wasn't just playing a game. She was setting a trap. And Claire had just stepped into it. Claire had spent weeks planning the perfect evening for Daniel's birthday. She had booked a private dinner at the Charles Hotel, selected a bouquet of fresh lilies, his favorite, and carefully wrapped an Omega watch, a symbol of her love and appreciation. This year, she was determined to make up for the birthday she had missed last year. As she left her office early, she felt a sense of quiet anticipation. Tonight was about them, about celebrating the life they had built together. Just as she stepped outside, she caught sight of her colleague Sarah, who hesitated before offering her a tight-lipped smile. "Enjoy your night, Claire," Sarah said, her voice oddly strained. Claire frowned, sensing something unspoken in her tone, but she brushed it off. It wasn't until she pulled into their condominium parking lot that the unease fully settled in. The lot was unusually crowded. Sleek BMWs, polished Mercedes, and, unmistakably, Vanessa's bright pink Porsche. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the elevator button. The mirrored walls reflected her own face back at her, but she barely recognized the expression, eyes wide with doubt, lips pressed together in uncertainty. A part of her wanted to believe she was overreacting. Maybe Daniel had planned a surprise gathering. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. Then she heard it. Laughter, music, the unmistakable pop of a champagne cork. The moment she stepped into the hallway, Vanessa's high-pitched giggle sliced through the air like a blade. The sound of heels, sharp, confident, clicked against the marble flooring. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the key tightly and turned it in the lock. The door swung open, revealing a scene that made the world tilt beneath her feet. The living room was filled with people, Daniel's colleagues, her mother's church friends, and, at the center of it all, Vanessa. She stood close to Daniel, her red Hervé Leger dress hugging every curve, her manicured fingers trailing lightly along the lapel of his suit. Around her neck, their mother's heirloom diamond necklace sparkled under the chandelier light. For a brief moment, the entire room fell silent. Conversations halted, champagne glasses froze mid-air. The weight of the moment pressed down on Claire as every set of eyes turned toward her. Then, Vanessa smirked. "Oops. Busted." Her voice was light, teasing, but there was something else beneath it. Triumph. Claire's gaze snapped to Daniel. His face had gone pale, his fingers tightening around the glass in his hand. The same navy suit he had worn that morning, the same crisp shirt, except now, a faint smudge of red lipstick lingered near his collar. Their mother was the first to recover. She rose from the plush armchair, adjusting the collar of her Chanel blazer with practiced ease. "Claire," she said coolly, surveying her daughter with a detached gaze. "How unusual for you to come home early." The words hit like a slap. Claire felt something slip from her grasp, the carefully wrapped gift bag she had held so tightly. The Omega box tumbled to the floor, the blue ribbon unraveling as it rolled beneath the table. Vanessa let out a soft laugh, stepping even closer to Daniel, her fingers brushing against his sleeve. "You know," she mused, her voice dripping with mock sympathy, "I was just keeping him company. It's been a long day for Daniel." Claire could barely breathe. Her mother took a step forward, eyes sharp, calculating. "Sign the divorce papers and keep quiet." The words rang out, cold and final. There was no hesitation, no feigned concern. Just a command, delivered with the same indifference as placing an order at a restaurant. Claire's vision blurred for a moment. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the audacity, the sheer cruelty of it. Her mother, the woman who was supposed to protect her, was orchestrating her downfall. Vanessa, her own sister, was reveling in it. And Daniel, he had let it happen. The room was still frozen in silence, waiting, watching. Daniel finally spoke, his voice hoarse, desperate. "Claire, wait. Let me explain. She didn't move. She turned, walking past him with slow, steady steps, her back straight despite the tears threatening to spill. The murmurs in the room grew louder, but she blocked them out. She reached for the door, gripping the handle with shaking fingers. As she stepped out into the hallway, she heard a door creak open behind her. Footsteps followed, heels echoing against the floor. Someone had come after her. But she didn't turn back. The cold night air hit her as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the lights of Cambridge stretching out before her. She pulled out her phone, her hands still trembling, and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name. With one deep breath, she pressed the call button. "Carol," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have a moment?" And just like that, she knew, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Claire sat in the dimly lit suite of the Charles Hotel, the Boston skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights shimmered like stars, distant and indifferent to the storm raging inside her. Across from her, Carol sat with an air of quiet authority, her posture composed, hands delicately wrapped around a porcelain teacup. Claire had barely touched her drink. The numbness from the evening still clung to her, but beneath it, something sharper was emerging, a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. "You did the right thing by calling me," Carol said, her voice steady, unwavering. Claire exhaled shakily, her fingers tightening around the edge of the coffee table. "I didn't know who else to turn to. You called the right person." Before Claire could respond, a knock at the door sent a ripple of tension through the air. Carol's gaze remained steady as she nodded toward the entrance. Claire hesitated, then rose and opened the door. Daniel stood there, disheveled, his tie loosened, exhaustion etched into his face. His normally confident stance was gone, replaced with something unsteady, almost fragile. "Claire," he said softly, his voice raw. "Please." Carol didn't move. She merely lifted her hand, motioning for him to sit. There was an unspoken command in her voice when she finally spoke. "Tell us everything." Daniel hesitated, but under Carol's sharp gaze, he sank into the chair opposite Claire. He ran a hand over his face, his confidence stripped away. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "It started a month ago," he admitted. "Vanessa showed up at my office, crying. She said she was in trouble." Claire remained still, her jaw tightening. "She told me she owed $200,000, Daniel continued. "Illegal casinos. Loan sharks. She said collectors were coming after her, that they had already started showing up at night." Claire's breath hitched. She had known Vanessa was reckless, but this was something far worse. "I told her there was nothing I could do," Daniel said, his hands clenching into fists. "But she wouldn't stop. She started calling me every day, showing up at events. Then, your mother got involved." Claire flinched at the mention of Susan. "What did she do?" Daniel swallowed hard. "She pressured me. She said it was my duty to help Vanessa, that I should take care of family because you wouldn't. She told me that if I just provided a little inside information, just a small real estate tip, it would wipe the debt clean." Carol's expression darkened, but she remained silent, allowing Daniel to continue. "I refused," he said firmly. "I swear to you, Claire, I refused. But they wouldn't stop. They cornered me. Vanessa threatened to tell you that we were having an affair, that I had been seeing her behind your back." Claire felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. "And the party?" she asked, her voice quiet but cutting. Daniel let out a slow, shuddering breath. "That was Vanessa's final move. She told me if I didn't cooperate, she would humiliate you in front of everyone. Show you that you had no real place in your own marriage, in your own family. She wanted to break you." Silence filled the room. Claire's fingers dug into her palms. Carol finally spoke, her voice sharp as steel. "And you let her. Daniel's head snapped up. I didn't know what to do. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. But I see now that was a mistake. A mistake. Claire's voice was eerily calm. You stood there and let my sister kiss you. You let my mother tell me to sign divorce papers in front of a room full of people. Daniel looked at her, desperation flickering in his eyes. I was trying to protect you. Carol scoffed. By doing nothing? Daniel's face crumpled. I swear, Claire, I never touched her. I never betrayed you. Claire finally met his gaze. Maybe you didn't sleep with her, she said, her voice steady, but you let her take everything from me. You let them strip me of my dignity. The room went silent. Daniel had no defense. Carol slowly rose to her feet, smoothing down the front of her silk blouse. This is no longer just a family dispute, she said, her voice edged with steel. This is about something far more dangerous. Claire turned to her, a flicker of something new stirring inside her. What do we do? Carol's lips curved into a knowing smile. We take back what's yours. Claire had spent her whole life allowing Vanessa and Susan to manipulate her, to take advantage of her kindness. But not anymore. She straightened her shoulders, feeling a newfound strength settle in her chest. Then let's begin, she said. Outside, the Charles River shimmered beneath the moonlight. A new battle was about to start, and this time, Claire was ready. Sunday morning arrived with an air of quiet tension. The towering stained-glass windows of First Church in Cambridge cast fragmented light over the polished wooden pews, illuminating the hushed congregation. The usual murmur of polite conversation hummed through the air, mingling with the scent of fresh lilies placed near the altar. But today, something was different. Claire sat beside Carol in the front row, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Though her posture was composed, her pulse pounded beneath the surface. She had barely touched her breakfast that morning, her mind replaying everything Carol had meticulously planned over the last 48 hours. Carol had been clear, this was not just about exposing Vanessa and Susan. This was about taking back control. Across the aisle, Susan sat with perfect poise, her fingers curled lightly around her Bible. She looked unbothered, her pearl earrings gleaming in the soft light. But Claire saw the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the tight set of her jaw. Vanessa, however, was nowhere to be seen. At exactly 11:30, Carol stood. The sound of her heels against the stone floor echoed through the silent church as she made her way to the front. She turned to face the congregation, her expression serene but unwavering. I have an important announcement, she said, her voice calm, controlled. The murmur of conversation halted. All eyes turned toward her. As many of you know, my family has been a part of this church for generations, Carol continued. And with that comes a responsibility to uphold the values we all hold dear, integrity, honesty, and faith. She paused, letting her words settle. The tension in the air thickened. It has recently come to my attention that Susan Bennett has misappropriated funds from the church's charity account. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Claire's mother flinched but quickly masked her reaction, her fingers tightening around the Bible in her lap. Carol remained composed. These funds, which were intended for community outreach programs, were instead used to cover the gambling debts of her eldest daughter, Vanessa Bennett. A stunned silence filled the room. Claire could hear the sharp intake of breath from those around her. The evidence has been submitted to the church council, Carol continued, her voice never wavering. A full audit is underway. I trust that those responsible will be held accountable. Claire watched as the reality of Carol's words sank in. The social elite who had once flocked to her mother now leaned away, their gazes cool, judgmental. Some whispered in hushed voices, their expressions shifting from shock to quiet condemnation. Susan's face drained of color, but she did not speak. For the first time, she had no power, no control. This was only the beginning. By the following morning, a discreet but damning article appeared in the Cambridge Chronicle, detailing the scandal. Though it never outright accused Vanessa, it subtly referenced a prominent church member's daughter with well-documented gambling debts. Claire read the article over breakfast, her fingers wrapped around her coffee mug as she absorbed every carefully chosen word. "Carol's strategy is working," she murmured, glancing across the table. Carol simply nodded, turning the page of her newspaper. "The social consequences will be swift. The financial ones, even swifter." She was right. Within the week, Susan received a sudden resignation recommendation from the Women's Association she had presided over for years. Invitations to high-profile charity events were rescinded. The polished social world she had built her reputation upon crumbled beneath her feet. And Vanessa? Claire watched from the window of a quiet cafe as her sister, once adorned in designer dresses and draped in diamonds, stepped out of a courthouse, her posture stiff with barely concealed humiliation. The lawsuit had moved quickly. The debt collectors, armed with the information Carol had provided, had descended like vultures. Vanessa's assets, her car, her jewelry, her bank accounts, were seized. She had no way out. "Please," Vanessa had begged on the phone just days before. "Claire, you have to help me." Claire had simply listened, waiting for her sister's usual manipulative tone to creep in. But this time, there was only desperation. "Help you?" she had repeated, her voice even. "The way you helped me?" The silence on the other end of the line had stretched long and thin before Vanessa finally exhaled a shuddering breath. "I didn't think they'd actually come after me," she had whispered. Claire had hung up without another word. Now, she watched as Vanessa hesitated at the curb, no longer stepping into the comfort of a chauffeur-driven car but instead waiting for a bus. The sight was almost surreal. Beside her, Carol took a slow sip of tea, her gaze following Claire's. "Actions have consequences," she murmured. Claire didn't respond. She had spent her whole life believing that family meant loyalty, that no matter how cruel Vanessa was, no matter how manipulative her mother could be, they were still blood. But family was not defined by shared DNA. It was defined by the people who stood beside you, who protected you, who lifted you up instead of tearing you down. And in that moment, watching Vanessa disappear into the crowd, Claire realized she no longer felt anger. No longer felt the need for vengeance. She only felt free. She turned back to Carol, a slow breath escaping her lips. "Let's go home," she said. Carol smiled. "Yes," she agreed. "Let's." 1 year later, the golden morning sun filtered through the large bay windows of Claire's new home, casting a warm glow over the breakfast table. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm brioche filled the air, mingling with the light breeze drifting in from the garden. She set the last plate down and took a quiet moment to take it all in. The house on Brattle Street had become a sanctuary, a home that was hers, built not from obligation or sacrifice, but from freedom and choice. Across the table, Carol smiled approvingly, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. "You always find the best bakeries," she said with an amused lift of her brow. Claire chuckled, pouring herself another cup of tea. "It's from the new patisserie near Harvard Square. I thought you'd like it." At the head of the table, Daniel looked up from the newspaper. The shadows that had once lingered in his eyes had faded. The weight of regret had loosened its grip, replaced by something lighter, something that felt like peace. They had rebuilt, piece by piece, leaving behind the wreckage of betrayal and manipulation. And soon, their family would grow. Claire placed a hand on her stomach unconsciously, a secret she had held onto for the past few weeks. She had planned to wait for the perfect moment, but as she glanced between Daniel and Carol, she realized, there was no need to wait. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice steady but tinged with quiet excitement. Carol's sharp gaze flickered to Claire's hand before her lips curved into a knowing smile. "Oh, my dear," she murmured. "Could it be?" Daniel's chair scraped against the floor as he pushed back, eyes widening in shock. "Claire," he said breathlessly. "Are you?" "3 months," she confirmed softly. For a moment, there was silence, then Daniel was on his feet, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace so tight it stole her breath. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he murmured against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. Claire let out a quiet laugh, her eyes damp with unshed tears. "I wanted to wait for the right time." Carol, ever composed, simply smiled, watching them with warmth in her eyes. "This is wonderful news," she said, her voice softer than usual. "A new beginning." And it truly was. Outside, the church bells from First Church in Cambridge rang in the distance, a sound that once filled Claire with apprehension, but now felt like a quiet blessing. In the past year, she had found her place in the community, not as a woman overshadowed by her past, but as someone who had reclaimed her own identity, her own future. She and Carol had joined the church's charity board, not for status or appearances, but because they wanted to build something meaningful. For the first time, Claire was shaping her own narrative. She thought of Vanessa sometimes. Her sister had vanished from their social circles, retreating to a quiet existence in New York after her bankruptcy. Their mother had faded into irrelevance, spending her final years in a modest assisted living home, stripped of the power she had once wielded. But Claire no longer felt anger. She had let go. "You're thinking about them, aren't you?" Daniel asked gently, his hand covering hers. Claire blinked, then exhaled a slow breath. "Not in the way I used to," she admitted. "I'm not angry anymore." "Good," Carol said simply. "Because your future is far too bright to be haunted by the past." Claire met her gaze, feeling the truth of those words settle deep inside her. For so long, she had been trapped, by expectation, by obligation, by the poisonous belief that family meant unquestioning loyalty. But family was not defined by blood alone. It was Daniel, who had fought to make things right. It was Carol, who had shown her strength when she had none left. And it was the child she now carried, the future, unwritten and full of promise. As they stepped outside into the crisp spring air, Daniel's fingers intertwined with hers, Carol walking beside them, Claire smiled. This was not just a new chapter. This was the life she had chosen. And it was only the beginning. This story delivers a powerful message about resilience, self-worth, and the true meaning of family. Claire's journey teaches us that family is not defined by blood, but by those who stand by us, support us, and lift us up in times of hardship. She learns that loyalty should not come at the cost of self-respect, and that sometimes, walking away from toxic relationships is the only way to reclaim one's life. Through betrayal, heartbreak, and eventual triumph, Claire transforms from a woman trapped by obligation into someone who chooses her own future, free from manipulation and control. Her story reminds us that we are not bound by our past, and that healing comes not from revenge, but from building a life of peace, love, and integrity. In the end, Claire's greatest victory is not just justice, but the ability to move forward without bitterness, only strength, clarity, and hope.